Okay, so you want to own a medieval mill. You picture it already. A stone wheelhouse beside a slow green river. The great wheel turning in the current. Sacks of grain stacked by the door, a fine dust of flour hanging gold in the afternoon light, and a line of grateful villagers bringing you their harvest. It looks like the most peaceful business in the world. A machine that does the work while you collect the coin. Honest bread, honest money. Now here is a single line from a real court record. The manor of Great Waltham in Essex in the reign of Edward I. Fine 6 shillings taken from a group of villagers because they did not grind at the Earl's mill. Read that again. They were not fined for stealing. They were not fined for fighting. They were fined for grinding their own grain, in their own homes, with their own hands. That is the part the peaceful picture leaves out. The mill by the river was not a service the village was lucky to have. It was a law the village was forced to obey, and the man who owned it did not get rich by grinding grain well. He got rich by making sure no one else was allowed to grind it at all. We are going to build one of these, a real mill on a real English manor around the year 1300. We will follow the coins in and out, and by the end you will understand something that almost nobody who romanticizes the Middle Ages ever grasps. The mill was never a machine for making flour. It was a machine for collecting a tax, and the tax had a name. First, let's correct the picture, because the picture gets the whole business backwards. You think the mill's product is flour. It isn't. Flour is what the peasant already knew how to make. For thousands of years in every village on earth, a household ground its own grain at home. You did it with a hand mill, 2 heavy discs of stone called a quern. The bottom stone sits still, the top stone turns. You pour grain into a hole in the middle, you turn the handle, and flour comes out of the edge. It is slow, it is heavy work, and it was usually done by women hour after hour, and it cost nothing but time and effort. Every family could do it. Every family did do it. For most of human history, grinding your own grain was as normal as boiling your own water. So the mill did not invent flour. The mill is faster, yes. The water does the turning instead of your arm. The flour is finer with less grit in it. Those are real advantages. But here is the thing you have to hold on to, because everything else depends on it. If the mill only had to compete on being faster and better, it would be an ordinary business. Some people would use it. Some people would keep grinding at home. You would have to be good, keep your prices fair, and win customers the honest way. That is not the business you are buying, because your mill does not compete with the hand mill. Your mill is going to make the hand mill illegal. Let's talk about how you get the right to do that, because this is where the money actually begins, and it has nothing to do with the wheel. On a medieval manor, the lord holds certain rights over the people who live on his land. Rights to their labor, rights to their loyalty, rights to fees when they marry, fees when they inherit, fees when they die. And among these rights is one of the most valuable of all. It was called suit of mill. Suit of mill meant that every tenant on the manor was legally bound to bring all the grain grown, used, and eaten in their household to one specific mill. The lord's mill. Your mill they could not grind at home. They could not carry their grain to a rival mill in the next village where the toll might be cheaper. The law of the manor tied them to your door. Sit with what that means as a business. You do not have to attract customers, you inherit them. Every household within the boundary of the manor is a customer, whether they like you or not, whether your flour is good or not, whether your price is fair or not. The peasant who grows the grain, threshes the grain, and hauls the grain to your mill has no choice about where it gets ground. He is not shopping. He is complying. Most people think a monopoly means you are the only seller in the area. This is stronger than that. This is a monopoly where buying from someone else or making it yourself is a crime. You are not the best option. You are the only legal option, and the alternative isn't a competitor. The alternative is a fine. Now the fee. When the peasant's grain is ground at your mill, you do not take money. Most of them barely have money. You take grain. You keep a portion of everything that passes through. That portion has a name, and if you remember one word from this entire video, make it this one. Multure. Multure is the cut. It is the share of the flour taken off the top that the mill keeps as payment for the grinding, and the size of that cut is the whole game. The rate varied from manor to manor, and the variation itself tells you everything about how this business really worked. On some manors, a serf and unfree tenant bound to the land might pay 1 part in 13. Free man on the same manor, who had more legal standing and could in theory take his grain elsewhere, might pay only 1 part in 24. Think about what that gap reveals. The price was not set by the cost of grinding. Grinding a free man's grain costs exactly the same as grinding a serf's grain. The same water turns the same wheel. The price was set by how little power the customer had. The man who could not say no paid nearly double the man who could. That is not a service fee. That is a measure of helplessness, converted directly into flour. And here is the part that makes it a genuine tax rather than a purchase. It never stops. A peasant does not grind once. He grinds every week of his life, and so did his father, and so will his son. Every loaf of bread that family will ever eat passes through your mill first, and every time it does, a slice comes off the top and goes to you. 1 part in 13 forever. It is a tax on the most basic act there is, the act of eating. You have found a way to stand between every human being on the manor and their daily bread, and to charge them for the privilege of getting through. So before you have ground a single grain, understand what you actually own. Not a machine, a choke point. a narrow gate that everyone on the manor must pass through to survive, and a legal right to charge them at the gate. Now let's build the thing, because the gate is not free, and this is where a lot of would-be lords went wrong. A mill is expensive, much more expensive than the peaceful picture suggests. You cannot simply set a wheel in a stream and walk away. A watermill needs a reliable, controlled flow of water, and rivers do not naturally provide that. So you have to build the water itself, in a sense. You dig a channel, called a leat, to carry water from the river to the wheel. You build a dam or a weir to raise the level and control the flow. You may need a millpond to store water for the dry weeks when the river runs low, because a mill with no water is just an expensive shed. Then the machinery, the wheel, the gears, the shaft, and the millstones themselves, which are not ordinary rocks. Good millstones were cut from particular kinds of hard stone, and the best were quarried far away and shipped at great cost. Some were brought across the sea from the continent. We have a real example that shows both the cost and the danger, and it is worth walking through because it is the whole risk of this business in one building. In the 1290s, on a manor at Ibstone in the Chilterns, the lord built a windmill. Windmills were the newer technology, used where the water didn't flow fast enough to turn a wheel. The accounts survive, and they tell you this was no small thing. Timber and skilled craftsmen were brought in from other counties. The millstones were imported from Europe and hauled up from London. This was a serious investment, the medieval equivalent of installing heavy industrial equipment in a place with no roads. Now here is what happened to that investment. Within 30 years, the mill was a wreck. The accounts describe it falling apart from lack of a roof and, in plain words, several defects. Planks and boards had been stolen off it. They poured money into repairs. A few years after that, they couldn't even find a tenant willing to run it for a full year. Then the plague came, and the accounts note the mill's income was small because so many of the people who used it were dead. And finally, in the early 1370s, the whole thing burned down. Hold that story, because it contains the second truth of this business, sitting right next to the first. The mill is a monopoly, which makes it a fortune. But the mill is also a fragile, expensive, constantly breaking piece of machinery sitting in water and weather, and that makes it a bottomless hole you pour money into. The wheel wears, the gears wear, the waterway silts up and floods and has to be dug out. The millstones themselves grind down and have to be recut or replaced. A mill left alone does not sit there quietly earning. A mill left alone rots. You have bought a machine that prints money and demands money in the same breath. And if you ever stop feeding it, it dies and takes your investment with it. So who actually runs it? Standing in the flour dust day after day, usually not you. If you are the Lord, you almost certainly do not turn the wheel yourself. You have two choices. You can employ a miller directly, paying him to run your mill and collect your multure for you. Or more commonly and more cleverly, you lease the mill out. You rent it to a miller for a fixed sum every year, and he keeps whatever he can squeeze out of it above that rent. Think about how good that second arrangement is for you. You hand over the fragile machine and all its daily headaches, all the broken gears and the angry customers and the cold mornings, to another man. He owes you a fixed rent no matter what. If the harvest is bad and the grain doesn't come, that is his problem, not yours. Your rent is your rent. You have taken the monopoly and stripped out almost all the operational risk, pushing it down onto the miller, while keeping the guaranteed income for yourself. Which means the man actually standing in the mill, the miller himself, is in a strange and difficult position. He has paid you a hefty rent up front, or owes it. Now he has to extract more than that from the villagers to make any living at all. His tool for doing that is the multure, that cut off the top, and the multure is measured in the least precise way imaginable. He scoops it. He judges it by eye. Nobody in that mill has an exact scale that everyone trusts. So the entire relationship between the miller and every single one of his forced customers comes down to one endlessly suspicious question. How big was the scoop? This is why the medieval miller is one of the most hated figures in all of European folklore, and it is not an accident of personality. It is baked into the economics. He is the visible face of a tax nobody agreed to. The lord who imposed the monopoly lives in a manor house and is rarely seen, but the miller is right there, in the village, with his hands in your grain. And he has every incentive to take a little more than his share because he has a rent to pay and his own family to feed, and the only place that extra can come from is your flour. The villagers knew it. They watched his scoop like hawks, and the culture around them said out loud, constantly, that the miller was a thief. There was a riddle that went around medieval England. What is the boldest thing in the world? The answer: a miller's shirt, for it clasps a thief by the throat every single day. Chaucer, writing his Canterbury Tales in this very period, gives us a miller who is a broad, brutal, dishonest brawler, a man who steals grain and charges triple and dares you to say anything about it. That was not a random insult. That was the popular verdict on an entire profession, and the court records back it up. What survives about medieval millers is overwhelmingly complaints. Complaints of false weights, complaints of overcharging, complaints of theft. When historians go looking for millers in the documents, mostly what they find is people accusing them of cheating. But step back for a second and see the whole trap, because the miller is caught in it as tightly as anyone. He is despised, he is watched, he is accused. And why? because he is the one collecting a tax that he did not invent, on behalf of a lord he barely sees, from neighbors who have no choice but to hand it over. He absorbs all the hatred that the system generates, while the lord absorbs most of the profit. The miller's reputation is bad because his job is to be the point of contact between an unfair law and the people it falls on. He is the toll booth on a road nobody wanted built. Before we get to the resistance, understand that the mill was rarely alone. The cleverest lords did not stop at grinding. Once you have discovered that you can force every tenant through a single gate and charge them at it, the obvious next question is how many gates you can build, and the answer on a well-run manor was several. Take the oven. Bread does not stop at flour. The flour has to be baked, and baking bread properly needs a hot oven, which needs fuel and skill and space. So many manors ran a lord's oven and bound the tenants to it exactly as they were bound to the mill. This was called the right of the common oven. You could not bake your own bread at your own hearth without breaking the custom. You carried your dough to the lord's oven and paid a fee to have it baked, a portion in kind or in coin, top of the multure you had already paid to have the grain ground. So a single loaf of bread could be taxed twice on its way to the table. Once at the mill for the grinding and once at the oven for the baking. The same trick applied to the next step in the same chain, and then on some manors a third gate. Ordinary people drank ale daily, and ale is made from malted grain, and malting and brewing at scale could be tied to the lord's monopoly too, tenant bound to use the lord's malt or the lord's brewing rights. Grind at my mill, bake at my oven, brew with my malt. 3 tolls on the 3 things a household did with grain, which was very nearly everything a household did to stay alive. Historians have a word for these bundled compulsory monopolies. They call them banalities from the Lord's ban, his command. That word is worth holding on to, because it tells you how the people on the receiving end came to feel about them. The everyday grinding, unavoidable fees on the everyday grinding business of survival. So relentless and so ordinary that a word for the Lord's compulsory monopolies became over the centuries our word for the dull and the tiresome. Banal. The tax was so constant it became a synonym for boredom. Now consider who held some of the largest of these monopolies, because it complicates the picture in a way the peaceful version never mentions. Many of the greatest milling rights in England were held not by knights and barons but by the church. Abbeys and monasteries were among the biggest and most determined mill lords in the country, precisely because they were permanent institutions that never died, never split their estates among heirs, and never forgot a right once they held it. A lay lord might lose his rights in a bad marriage or a lost war. An abbey held on for centuries, its account rolls remembering every fee owed since before anyone alive was born. There was even a claim attributed to a pope of the era that the very wind a windmill used belonged to the church, and that no windmill should turn without the church's blessing and its cut. Whether or not that was ever seriously enforced, the instinct behind it is the pure logic of this entire business. Find the thing everyone needs, declare that you own the right to it, and charge for access, even the air. So the mill sat inside a whole web of these gates, and the multure was only the first and most important thread of it. Which is why, when the resistance finally came, it did not come as a complaint about milling fees. It came as something much larger. People will risk a great deal to avoid a tax on eating, and the way they avoided it exposes exactly what the mill really was. Remember the quern, the hand mill? The simple pair of stones every household used to own? The lord's monopoly depended on those stones disappearing. As long as a family could grind its own grain at home, quietly in the corner of a cottage, it did not need the mill, and it did not pay the multure. So the enforcement of the monopoly became in large part a war on hand mills, and it was a real war fought in the manor courts year after year. Peasants caught grinding at home were fined. Peasants caught carrying their grain to a rival mill were fined, and it could get worse than a fine. On some manors, the custom held that if a man was caught taking his grain to the wrong mill, and it wasn't his first offense, the lord could seize his horse, and the miller could seize whatever grain or flour the poor man was carrying. Take a moment with that. To protect the profits of a grinding business, the law would confiscate a working family's horse. That is not how you protect a service. That is how you protect a tax. And now the story that shows this more clearly than any account book ever could. It comes from St. Albans, one of the great monastic towns of England, where the mill monopoly was held not by a lay lord but by a wealthy abbey. The abbey held the milling rights over the whole town and the surrounding villages, and it enforced them hard because those rights were an enormous source of income. But the townspeople resisted. They set up their own hand mills in their homes, quietly, off the books, grinding their own grain and starving the abbey's monopoly of its due. In the early 1330s, the abbot, a formidable man named Richard of Wallingford, decided to crush this once and for all. He sent men through the town and confiscated the hand mills. Around 80 of them gathered up out of people's homes. And then he did something that tells you exactly how this business understood itself. He did not throw the stones away or grind them up. He took those 80 confiscated hand mills, the stones on which ordinary families had been feeding themselves, and he had them cemented into the floor of the abbey parlor. Pavement made of the crushed independence of the town. Every monk who walked across that floor walked on the defeated self-sufficiency of the people outside the walls. It was a monument, a permanent, deliberate reminder of who controlled the grinding of grain set in stone underfoot. 50 years the townspeople walked past that abbey, knowing their own hand mills were paving the monk's floor. And then came 1381, the great rising that we call the Peasants' Revolt. When the revolt reached St. Albans, the townsfolk did not just make demands about taxes and freedom in the abstract. They went into the abbey. They found the parlor, tore up the floor, and they broke those millstones back out of the pavement and smashed them and carried the pieces out to the crowd, handing the fragments around. The horrified monk who recorded it wrote as if they were pieces of Holy Communion bread, passing them out like sacred hosts. Because to those people, that is what those stones were, not machinery. The right to feed yourself without paying a tax to eat. They had watched that right buried in a floor for 2 generations, and now they were digging it up with their hands. That is the whole business, compressed into one image. On one side, a wealthy institution treating control of the mill as something worth setting in stone forever. On the other, ordinary people who understood, with perfect clarity, that the fight over the mill was never a fight about flour. It was a fight about whether the most basic act of survival would be free or taxed. The monopoly was not a background detail of their lives. It was one of the sharpest edges of the whole system, and when they finally got the chance to strike at what oppressed them, the millstones were one of the very first things they went for. So let's put the numbers together. Could you actually get rich owning a medieval mill? Build the year, and let's be honest that what follows is a reconstruction, calibrated to the real figures we do have, not a single surviving ledger pulled from a chest. The rates are real, the costs are real, the shape is real, the exact totals are a model. Start with a good year, the harvest is strong. The manor is populous with, say, 200 or 300 households all legally bound to your mill. Every one of them brings their grain week after week, and every time your cut comes off the top. Multure at a serf's rate is a heavy slice of a huge flow. Across a full year, the grain a busy manor mill could take in tolls alone was a serious income, easily many times the annual wage of a laborer, sometimes far more because you were skimming a percentage off the entire food supply of an entire community. On top of the grinding, a well-run mill earned in other ways. The lord's own grain was ground first and free. Some mills sat by bridges and the miller collected the bridge tolls too. Some manors folded in other monopolies, forcing tenants to bake their bread in the lord's oven for another fee, or brew with the lord's malt. Stack it up, and in a good year on a good manor, the mill was one of the single most profitable assets the lord owned. Contemporary estimates suggest the milling industry across England around the year 1300 generated an enormous aggregate profit, and that money flowed overwhelmingly into the hands of the lords who held the monopolies. This is why the histories sometimes call the mill a license to print money. In a good year, that is exactly what it was. The cut off the top of everyone's bread, collected without effort, guaranteed by law. Now the average year, and here the picture becomes more careful. Out of that gross income come the costs, and the mill is a hungry, breaking thing. Repairs are constant. The wheel, the gears, the waterway all need work. Millstones wear down and must be dressed, recut, or replaced, and a new imported stone was a major expense. If you employ a miller directly, you pay his living. If you built the mill, that original construction cost, which could run to many years of a laborer's wages, has to be earned back slowly across decades, and every year some of your income is really just paying down that buried investment. In an average year, the mill still earns well. The monopoly still holds, the grain still flows, the cut still comes off the top. But a good part of what comes in goes straight back out into keeping the fragile machine alive. The lord who leased his mill out for a fixed rent was often the smartest man in this story, because he took a smaller but guaranteed sum and let the miller sweat the repairs and the bad weeks. Steady rent from a monopoly you never have to maintain is a beautiful thing to own. Then the bad year, and the bad year is brutal, because everything that made the mill strong turns against you at once. First, a poor harvest. Less grain grown means less grain ground, which means a smaller cut, because your income is a percentage of a flow that just shrank. But your costs do not shrink with it. The wheel still needs the same repairs whether it grinds much or little, the waterway still silts up, and then the machine itself can turn on you. Go back to that windmill at Ibstone. A roof left unfixed and the building rots. Fire and decades of investment are ash in an afternoon. Flood tears out your weir and your leat, and suddenly your mill has no water and earns nothing while you spend a fortune rebuilding the very river that feeds. And worst of all, the thing that no account book can fully capture: the people. A mill's whole value rests on the monopoly, and the monopoly rests on enforcement, and enforcement rests on the tenant's compliance. When times are hard enough, they stop complying. They dust off the hidden querns. They grind at home in the dark. They carry grain to a rival in the night. You can find them. You can seize their horses. You can pave your floor with their hand mills. But a mill in a rebellious district is a monopoly in name only, sitting expensive and idle while the grain it was built to tax gets ground in 100 kitchens you cannot see. In the very worst case, they come for the mill itself, as they came at St. Albans, and the asset you thought was permanent turns out to have been resting the whole time on other people's obedience. So who actually got rich? Not in the end the miller standing in the flour dust. hated and watched and squeezed between his rent and his neighbors. He made a living, sometimes a decent one, but he absorbed the risk and the loathing and rarely rose above his station. The people who got rich off the mill were the ones who held the right, not the ones who turned the wheel. The lords and the great abbeys who owned the monopoly leased it out, collected the rent or the multure, and spent none of their own days in the mill at all. They understood the real asset. It was never the machine. It was the law. The wheel and the stones were just the physical excuse for collecting a tax that the wheel and the stones made possible. Own the right to force everyone to grind at your gate, hand the fragile machinery to someone else, and let the cut come off the top of every loaf on the manor, year after year, generation after generation. That was the fortune. And you could hold it for centuries, as the abbeys did, as long as the people beneath you kept obeying. Look back at the mill one last time without the golden afternoon light, the slow wheel, the sacks of grain, the flour hanging in the air. It still looks peaceful, but now you know what you are actually seeing. Not a helpful machine that saved the village labor. A gate on the road between a family and their bread, with a man at the gate taking a slice every time they passed, and a law behind him that said they were not allowed to go around. The mill ground grain, yes, but grinding grain was never the business. The business was standing between people and the one thing they could not live without, and charging them for the crossing. The peasant who threshed his own wheat in his own field still could not eat it until he had paid a share to a lord he might never meet. That was not a service he was buying. That was a toll on survival itself. You thought you were buying a machine that made flour. What you were really buying was a place to stand between every person on the manor and their next meal. The water turned the wheel for free, but the wheel was never what you were selling. What you were selling was the fact that they had no other choice. The mill wasn't a machine. It was a tax with a roof over it.